The candlelight flickered across the pages of the illuminated manuscript as Brother Thomas dipped his quill into ink mixed that very morning, and he realized with a quiet shock that he was perhaps the last person in all of Christendom who still knew the precise recipe for this particular shade of blue made from lapis lazuli ground so fine it became almost liquid, mixed with egg white and honey in proportions his master had taught him 30 years ago when the world was different, and monasteries like this one at Lindisfarne seemed as permanent as the stones they were built from. The year was 1137, and Brother Thomas sat in the scriptorium of the monastery, a stone chamber on the second floor of the main building, where the light from the eastern windows fell most favorably across the writing desks, arranged in careful rows. He was 53 years old, had been a monk since the age of 15, had spent nearly 4 decades in this place, copying manuscripts, illuminating gospels, preserving the written knowledge of centuries in an age when books were rare and precious, when the written word was sacred in ways that went beyond its content to encompass the very act of writing itself. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Around him, the monastery hummed with its usual rhythms, the sounds that had structured his days for so long that he barely noticed them anymore except when they were absent. The bells for the canonical hours, dividing the day into segments of prayer and work, the shuffle of sandaled feet on stone floors as brothers moved between chapel and refectory, dormitory and cloister, the murmur of voices reading aloud in the chapel, the scratch of other quills in the scriptorium, the distant clang of the smithy where Brother William worked iron into tools and hinges. But underneath these familiar sounds, Thomas could sense something changing, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the place that made him uneasy, though he could not name exactly what troubled him. Perhaps it was the recent news from the continent brought by travelers and merchants of political upheavals and wars, of monasteries sacked and libraries burned. Perhaps it was the increasing age of the community, the way deaths were no longer being balanced by new postulants, the slow decline in numbers that meant empty seats in the chapel and unused cells in the dormitory. Or perhaps it was simply his own mortality becoming more real to him as he passed 50, his hands beginning to ache from the cold, his eyesight requiring more light than it once had, his awareness that he had perhaps 20 years remaining if he was fortunate, and he'd begun to think about what he would leave behind, what mark his life would make on the world beyond these walls. The manuscript he was working on today was a psalter, a book of psalms that would take him months to complete, each page a work of art as well as scholarship. He had already finished the text itself, copied from an older psalter in the monastery's library, his script careful and even, the Latin words flowing across the vellum in lines straight as ruled measurements. Now he was adding the illuminations, the decorated capitals and marginal illustrations that would transform the text into something beautiful as well as functional. This morning he was painting a letter D at the beginning of Psalm 1, Beatus vir qui non habit, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. The letter would be filled with intertwined vines and flowers, with a small portrait of David playing his harp, with gold leaf applied so carefully that it seemed to glow from within. It was work that required absolute concentration, a steady hand, perfect control of the brush and paint. Thomas had learned this craft from Brother Aldhelm, the master illuminator who had recognized something in the young postulant Thomas and had taken him as an apprentice. Brother Aldhelm had been old even then, his hands gnarled but still capable of extraordinary precision, his eye for color and composition trained by decades of practice. He had taught Thomas not just the techniques of illumination, but the philosophy behind it, the understanding that this work was itself a form of prayer. That beauty offered to God was as valid a devotion as hours spent on your knees in chapel. We are preserving light, Brother Aldhelm had told him once, holding up a page that gleamed with gold and brilliant pigments. The darkness is always pressing in, ignorance and barbarism and forgetting. But these books hold light, knowledge, beauty, faith. When we make them, we push back the darkness a little. We create something that will outlast us, that will carry our prayers and our learning into the future. Brother Aldhelm had been dead 15 years now, buried in the monastery cemetery overlooking the sea, and Thomas was the master illuminator, the keeper of techniques and recipes, the teacher of younger monks who wanted to learn the craft. Except there were no younger monks studying illumination now, no apprentices watching him work and learning the mysteries of pigment and gold leaf. The last novice who had shown interest had left the monastery 3 years ago, deciding that monastic life was not his calling, returning to the world outside. This troubled Thomas more than he liked to admit. Who would continue this work when he was gone? Who would know how to mix the lapis blue, how to apply gold leaf so it adhered perfectly, how to draw the fine lines and intricate patterns that made illumination an art? The knowledge was all in his head, in his hands, embodied in skills developed over decades. He had written down some of it in a small notebook he kept, recipes and techniques, but so much of it was intuitive, impossible to capture in words. He worked through the morning, adding tiny brushstrokes to the letter D, building up layers of color, creating depth and dimension. The work required such focus that the world fell away, and there was only the page, the image emerging under his hand, the satisfaction of seeing something beautiful taking form. This was when Thomas felt most at peace, most certain of his purpose, most connected to something larger than himself. At the Belfer Sext, the midday prayer, he carefully cleaned his brushes and covered his work, then joined the other monks filing into the chapel. There were 23 monks in residence now, down from 35 when Thomas had first arrived. Some had died, some had transferred to other houses, some had simply left. The abbot, Father Edmund, was concerned about the declining numbers, but seemed uncertain what to do about it. The chapel was cool and dim, lit by candles and the colored light filtering through stained glass windows. The monks took their places in the choir stalls, and the chanting began, the familiar Latin psalms filling the stone space with sound. Thomas had chanted these same psalms thousands of times, knew them by heart, could recite them without thinking. Sometimes the words still moved him, still felt fresh and meaningful. Other times they were simply sounds, a duty performed, part of the structure that held his life together. After the service, the monks filed to the refectory for the midday meal, eaten in silence while one of the brothers read aloud from the Rule of St. Benedict. The food was simple: bread, cheese, vegetable pottage, weak beer, but adequate, and Thomas ate mechanically, his mind already returning to the Psalter waiting in the scriptorium. But Father Edmund stopped him as he was leaving the refectory, asked him to come to the abbot's chambers for a conversation. This was unusual enough to make Thomas nervous, wondering what he might have done wrong, what issue might need addressing. The abbot's chamber was more comfortable than the monks' cells, with a small fireplace, a writing desk, shelves holding books and documents. Father Edmund was in his 60s, had been abbot for 12 years, was a learned man who had studied in France before taking vows. He gestured for Thomas to sit, poured wine into 2 cups, which was also unusual. Wine was generally reserved for feast days. "Brother Thomas," the abbot began, "I want to talk to you about the scriptorium, about the work being done there and the work that needs to be done in the years ahead." Thomas waited, unsure where this was going. "You know our situation," Father Edmund continued. "Our numbers declining, our income from our estates uncertain, the political situation unstable. I've been thinking about what we need to preserve, what we need to prioritize if difficult times come." "The manuscripts," Thomas said immediately. "Yes, the manuscripts. Our library is one of the finest in England, accumulated over centuries, copied and preserved by brothers like you. If anything were to happen to this monastery, if we were forced to evacuate, or if there were violence—" He paused, seemed reluctant to speak the possibility aloud. "We need to ensure that the most important manuscripts survive." Thomas felt a chill despite the fire. "You think something might happen?" "I think we live in uncertain times," the abbot said carefully. "The wars between Stephen and Matilda have not touched us directly, but that could change. And there are always raiders from the sea. bandits, fires, natural disasters. We have been fortunate, but fortune can change. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I want you to make copies of our most important manuscripts, not illuminated copies. We don't have time or resources for that. Simple, readable copies that could be sent to other monasteries for safekeeping, or hidden if necessary. And I want you to make a catalog, a complete list of everything in our library, with descriptions, so if the originals were lost, we would at least have a record of what existed. Thomas felt the weight of this task settling on his shoulders. That will take years, Father Abbot. I know, but I can't think of anyone better suited for it. You know our library better than anyone. You understand the importance of preservation, and you have the skills to do the work properly. What about the illumination work? The Psalter I'm completing? Continue with that as well when you have time. But the copying and cataloging should be your priority. I'll assign Brother Mark to assist you. He has a good hand for copying, even if he lacks your artistic skill. Thomas returned to the scriptorium that afternoon with his head full of thoughts about this new task. Making copies of manuscripts was familiar work. He had done it countless times over the years. But creating a complete catalog of the library was something else, something that would require him to examine and describe hundreds of books, many of which he had never studied closely. The monastery library occupied a large chamber adjacent to the scriptorium, its walls lined with shelves and chests containing books and scrolls. There were biblical texts, of course, multiple copies of the Gospels, the Epistles, the Prophets. There were theological works by the Church Fathers, commentaries and interpretations accumulated over centuries. There were histories and chronicles, lives of saints, philosophical treatises, medical texts, books on agriculture and astronomy, grammars and dictionaries. Some were ancient, copied from Roman originals, their Latin elegant and classical. Others were more recent products of the Carolingian Renaissance or later medieval scholarship. Some were beautifully illuminated, works of art as well as learning. Others were plain and functional, text only, valued for content rather than appearance. Thomas began that afternoon, starting with the biblical manuscripts, opening each one, examining its contents, making notes about its condition, its origins if known, any special features. Brother Mark joined him, a younger monk, though still 40 years old, who had been assigned to help with the copying work. "We are to make copies of all of these?" Brother Mark asked, looking somewhat overwhelmed at the scope of the task. "The most important ones," Thomas said. "The ones that would be hardest to replace, that contain unique information or rare texts. Father Abbot will help us decide which ones have priority." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, past Vespers and into the time usually reserved for private prayer or rest. The library revealed itself to Thomas in new ways as he examined each manuscript carefully, reading passages he had never looked at before, discovering annotations and marginalia left by previous readers, finding treasures he hadn't known existed. There was a copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, written in a hand that might have been contemporary with Bede himself, over 400 years old, its pages dark with age but still readable. There was a medical text containing remedies and surgical techniques, illustrated with diagrams of the human body. There was a bestiary filled with fanciful descriptions of animals real and imagined, with illuminations showing creatures no one in England had ever seen, elephants and crocodiles, unicorns and phoenixes. Each book represented countless hours of labor, the work of scribes long dead, preserving knowledge across generations. Thomas felt the weight of that continuity, the sense that he was part of a chain stretching backward to antiquity and forward to an unknown future. The books were bridges across time, allowing the dead to speak to the living, allowing the wisdom and folly of the past to inform the present. As the weeks passed and the catalogue grew, Thomas found himself thinking more deeply about the nature of his work, about what it meant to preserve knowledge in a world where so much was constantly being lost. Every time a monastery burned, every time a library was destroyed in war or neglect, irreplaceable knowledge vanished. The classical world had produced thousands of works, plays and poems, histories and philosophies, and only a fraction had survived to Thomas's time, preserved by monks like him who had recognized their value and worked to copy them. How much more would be lost in the future? How much of what Thomas was cataloging now would survive another 100 years, another 1,000? The thought was both sobering and motivating. Each copy he made was an act of defiance against oblivion, a statement that this knowledge mattered, that it deserved to survive. Brother Mark proved to be a capable assistant, his copying neat and accurate if not artistically distinguished. They worked side by side in the scriptorium, often in comfortable silence, the scratch of their quills and the occasional turning of pages the only sounds. Thomas found himself appreciating the companionship, the sense of shared purpose. "Why did you become a monk?" Thomas asked one day, breaking their usual silence. Brother Mark looked up from his work, considered the question. "My family couldn't afford to keep all of us," he said simply. "I was a third son, and my father arranged for me to enter the monastery when I was 12. I didn't really choose it, but I've made my peace with it. And the work we do," he gestured at the manuscripts around them, "it matters. I may not fully understand all of it, but I know it matters." Thomas nodded, remembering his own path to the monastery, which had been similar. His father had been a minor nobleman who had donated land to the monastery in exchange for accepting his younger son. Thomas had been 15, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to adapt. He had found purpose in the monastic life, had discovered his talent for illumination, had built a life that felt meaningful even if it was not the life he might have chosen for himself. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Mark asked. "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "When I was younger, more often. But where would I go? What would I do? This is the only life I know, and it's a good life in many ways. We have purpose, community, security. The world outside is harsh and uncertain. And yet our numbers decline," Mark said. "Fewer men choosing this life or being sent to it. Do you think monasteries have a future?" It was a question Thomas had been avoiding thinking about too directly. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Perhaps we're living in the twilight of something, the end of an age. Or perhaps it's just a cycle, and monasticism will renew itself in forms we can't yet imagine. All we can do is continue the work, preserve what we can, and hope it matters." As autumn turned to winter, the scriptorium grew cold despite the braziers burning in the corners. Thomas's hands ached from the chill, making the fine detail work of illumination difficult. He focused more on the copying and cataloging, work that required less precision, that he could do even when his fingers were stiff. The catalog was taking shape, a massive document that listed every manuscript in the library with descriptions of contents, condition, provenance, when known. Thomas wrote in a clear hand that would be legible to future readers, organizing the information systematically so it could be easily referenced. He was creating a map of the monastery's intellectual treasures, a guide that would allow someone unfamiliar with the collection to understand what it contained. Father Edmund reviewed the catalog regularly, making notes about which manuscripts should be copied first, which were most valuable or most rare. They decided to prioritize biblical texts that contained unusual readings or versions, historical chronicles that existed nowhere else, and scientific and medical works that contained practical knowledge. The copying work began in earnest after the new year. Thomas and Mark worked methodically through the priority list, producing clean, readable copies of each selected manuscript. The work was painstaking and often tedious, requiring absolute accuracy, checking and double-checking every word to ensure no errors crept in. A single mistake in copying could propagate through future copies, corrupting the text permanently. Thomas thought often about the scribes who had made the original manuscripts he was copying, wondering who they had been, what their lives had been like. Most had left no trace beyond their work, no names, no personal information. They were anonymous laborers in the great project of preservation, and their individual identities had been swallowed by time. Would the same be true of him? Would future readers look at his copies and illuminations without knowing or caring who had made them? The thought didn't trouble him as much as he might have expected. There was something appealing about the anonymity, about work done not for personal glory but for its own sake, for the sake of something larger than the individual. But he also felt a desire to leave some kind of message. some indication that he had been here, that he had thought and felt and questioned. He began keeping a journal, writing in it late at night by candlelight, recording his thoughts about the work, about monastic life, about the times he was living through. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but the act of writing helped him process his experiences, gave shape to thoughts that otherwise remained vague and undefined. "I am Brother Thomas," he wrote one winter night, "and I'm trying to preserve light in a darkening world. I do not know if I will succeed, if the work I do will matter in the long term, but I do it anyway because I can conceive of no better use of my time on earth." The books we preserve contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and each one we save is a victory against oblivion. As winter deepened, sickness came to the monastery. It started with Brother Peter, the oldest monk, who developed a cough that would not leave him. Then others fell ill, one by one, until nearly half the community was confined to the infirmary. The infirmarian, Brother John, did what he could with herbs and prayers, but medieval medicine had limited effectiveness against serious illness. Brother Peter died in February, peacefully in his sleep, and was buried in the cemetery overlooking the sea. He had been 84 years old, had been a monk for 60 years, and his passing felt like the breaking of a link to an earlier time. Thomas had known him as long as he had been at the monastery, and the old man's absence created a void that was felt throughout the community. More deaths followed. The illness, whatever it was, seemed to target the elderly and infirm, passing through the community like a slow wave. By spring, the monastery had lost 6 brothers, reducing their numbers to 17. The chapel felt emptier, the chanting thinner, the sense of community diminished. Father Edmund aged visibly during these months, the weight of leadership heavy on him. He spent more time in prayer, less time on administrative tasks, and Thomas worried about what would happen if the abbot himself fell ill. The monastery needed leadership, needed someone to make decisions and maintain order. And Edmund seemed to be withdrawing into contemplation. But the work in the scriptorium continued. Thomas and Mark kept copying, kept cataloging, driven by the sense that their work mattered even more now, that preserving the monastery's intellectual legacy was crucial when its physical community was weakening. Thomas found himself thinking about legacy and memory, about what endures after death. The monks who had died left behind almost nothing personal. A few possessions distributed to their brothers, memories that would fade as those who remembered them also died. But if they had been scribes, if they had copied books or created illuminations, that work would outlast them. Their hands would be gone, but the letters they had formed would remain, speaking to future generations in their absence. This thought gave Thomas comfort and urgency. He worked longer hours, pushing through exhaustion and hand cramps, determined to complete as much copying as possible. He finished 3 biblical manuscripts that spring, produced faithful copies that were packed carefully and sent to affiliated monasteries for safekeeping. If anything happened to Lindisfarne, these texts at least would survive. As spring turned to summer, news came of violence in the region. The civil war between Stephen and Matilda had intensified, with armed bands roaming the countryside, pillaging and burning. A monastery 20 miles south had been sacked, its monks killed or scattered, its library destroyed. The news sent a shudder through the community at Lindisfarne. Father Edmund called a meeting of all the monks, discussed plans for evacuation if necessary, for hiding valuables, for protecting what could be protected. The most precious manuscripts would be sealed in chests and hidden in a crypt beneath the chapel. The monks would flee to affiliated houses if raiders came, carrying what they could, abandoning the buildings if necessary. Thomas listened to these plans with a sinking heart, imagining the monastery empty and ruined, the scriptorium silent, the library ransacked. Everything he had worked for, everything the community had built over centuries, could be destroyed in an afternoon of violence. The fragility of it all struck him with terrible clarity. But the raid never came. The bands of soldiers moved elsewhere, and Lindisfarne was spared. Still, the threat had made the danger real, had transformed abstract worries into concrete possibilities. Father Edmund pushed harder for completion of the copying project. for distribution of duplicates to other monasteries, for protection of the library. Thomas worked with renewed intensity through the summer and into autumn, completing copy after copy, his hand moving almost automatically across the pages, forming letters he had formed thousands of times before. Brother Mark worked beside him, and together they made steady progress through the priority list. One afternoon in late autumn, as rain drummed against the windows and the light grew dim early, Thomas looked up from his work to find Father Edmund standing in the doorway of the scriptorium, watching him with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "Brother Thomas," the abbot said, "come walk with me." They walked through the cloister under the covered walkway that surrounded the garden, the rain visible beyond the columns, the air cool and damp. For a while they walked in silence, and Thomas waited for the abbot to speak. "I'm dying," Father Edmund said finally, his voice matter of fact. "I've known for some months. The physicians can do nothing. I have perhaps until winter, perhaps less." Thomas stopped walking, shocked. "Father Abbot, I'm telling you because I need you to understand the urgency of our work. When I'm gone, there will be transition, perhaps confusion. The new abbot may have different priorities. I need the copying project completed, or at least far enough along that it can continue without my protection." They resumed walking, slower now. "I've thought a great deal about legacy," Edmund continued, "about what we leave behind. I've been abbot for 12 years. But what does that mean? I've managed affairs, made decisions, tried to shepherd this community through difficult times. But will any of that be remembered? Will it matter in 100 years? Of course it will matter, Thomas said. Perhaps. But your work, Thomas, the manuscripts you've copied and illuminated, the catalogue you've created, that will definitely matter. That will outlast both of us, will serve purposes we can't imagine. You've spent your life preserving light, as Brother Aldhelm taught you, and that work is more important than anything I've done." Thomas felt tears prickling his eyes, though whether from sadness or gratitude or simply emotion, he couldn't say. "Finish the work," Edmund said. "Complete the catalogue, make the copies, preserve what you can. Promise me." "I promise, Father Abbot." Father Edmund died 6 weeks later, on a cold December morning, surrounded by the remaining brothers of the community. His death was peaceful, his passing marked by prayer and chanting, his body buried in the cemetery with simple ceremony. The community mourned but also felt a kind of relief. Edmund had been in increasing pain, and death had released him from suffering. The election of a new abbot took place in January, and Brother Anselm, the prior, was chosen by vote of the community. He was 50 years old, capable and organized, but without Edmund's scholarly inclinations. Thomas worried about the future of the copying project, but Anselm surprised him by reaffirming its importance and encouraging its continuation. "Father Edmund spoke to me before his death," Anselm told Thomas, "about the importance of preserving our library. I may not share his depth of learning, but I understand the value of what we hold here. Continue your work, Brother Thomas, with my blessing and support." And so the work continued through another winter and into spring, the rhythm of copying and cataloging becoming as natural as the rhythm of prayer and work that structured monastic life. Thomas found himself entering a kind of flow state during long hours at his desk, his consciousness narrowing to the page before him, the text he was reproducing, the careful formation of each letter. Brother Mark had become not just an assistant but a friend, one of the few close friendships Thomas had allowed himself in his years at the monastery. They talked while they worked, shared observations and reflections, supported each other through difficult passages and tedious sections. Mark was developing real skill as a scribe, his hand becoming more confident, his accuracy improving. "You should teach me illumination," Mark said one spring day, "so the knowledge doesn't die with you." Thomas looked up, surprised. "I thought there were no students interested." "I'm interested. I may not have your natural talent, but I can learn the basics, enough to pass them on to others, perhaps. And you were right to worry about the knowledge being lost. It's too valuable for that." So Thomas began teaching Mark the art of illumination, starting with the basics, preparing pigments, applying gold leaf, drawing simple decorative borders. Mark was not naturally gifted. his hand less steady than required for the finest work. But he was diligent and careful, and he improved with practice. Teaching forced Thomas to articulate things he had always done intuitively, to break down his process into steps that could be explained and demonstrated. He found he enjoyed it, enjoyed sharing what he knew, enjoyed seeing Mark's progress, and it gave him hope that perhaps the knowledge would survive him after all, would be passed on to another generation. As Thomas entered his late 50s, he began to feel the effects of age more acutely. His eyesight was definitely failing, requiring more light and making detailed work difficult. His hands ached almost constantly from arthritis, especially in cold weather. He could no longer work the long hours he once had, needing more rest, more breaks. But the catalogue was nearly complete, a comprehensive record of the monastery's library filling dozens of pages, and many of the most important manuscripts had been copied and distributed to other houses. If disaster came to Lindisfarne now, much of the library's contents would survive elsewhere. Thomas allowed himself to feel satisfaction with this accomplishment, even a kind of pride. Though pride was supposedly a sin, he had preserved light, had pushed back against oblivion, had ensured that knowledge and beauty would survive into the future. His life had purpose and meaning, had contributed to something larger than himself. He continued working on the Psalter in whatever time remained after the copying tasks, adding illuminations slowly, no longer racing to finish, but savoring each image, each decorative element. The book was becoming his masterpiece, the culmination of his skills and experience, the finest work he had ever produced. He thought of it as a gift to the future, as his personal offering of beauty to God and to anyone who would see it in years to come. One summer evening, after Compline, the final prayer service of the day, Thomas walked alone in the monastery garden, enjoying the soft light and mild air. The garden was a peaceful place, carefully tended by Brother Ambrose, filled with herbs and flowers, vegetables and fruit trees. It was a reminder that the monastery was not just a place of prayer and scholarship, but also of practical work, of growing food and making things, of sustaining life. Thomas thought about all the gardens that had existed on this spot over the centuries the monastery had stood here, all the monks who had planted and weeded and harvested, whose work had fed communities now long dead. The garden was renewed every year, but it was always essentially the same garden, part of an unbroken tradition of cultivation. The same was true of the library, he realized. Individual books might be lost, but the library itself persisted, was renewed by new acquisitions and copies, maintained by successive generations of librarians and scribes. His work was part of that tradition, one link in a chain that stretched into the past and the future. He felt at peace in that moment, felt that his life had been well lived, that he had no major regrets. He had not chosen monastic life initially, but he had made it his own, had found purpose and meaning in it, had contributed something of value. If he died tomorrow, he could die knowing that something of him would remain, embodied in the manuscripts he had created. But he didn't die tomorrow. He lived on through his 60s and into his 70s, continuing to work even as his body weakened, continuing to teach Brother Mark and occasionally other younger monks who showed interest in the craft. The scriptorium remained his center, the place where he felt most himself, most aligned with his purpose. The monastery itself continued its slow decline in numbers, down to a dozen monks by the time Thomas turned 70. But it also adapted, found new ways to sustain itself, maintained its mission of prayer and preservation. The library remained intact. The copying work continued. The tradition persisted. Thomas's final illumination, completed at age 72, was a portrait of Saint Benedict holding the rule, set into an elaborate border of vines and flowers. His hand shook as he applied the last touches of gold leaf, but the image was still beautiful, still worthy, still an offering of light. He signed it, which was unusual. Most illuminations were anonymous, but he wanted this one to carry his name, wanted future viewers to know that Brother Thomas had created it. The Psalter was finally finished, a work that had taken years of his life, that represented the peak of his artistic achievement. It was bound in leather and kept in the library's most secure chest, protected from light and moisture, preserved for the future. Thomas died quietly in his sleep at age 74. His body worn out, but his mind clear until the end. He was buried in the cemetery overlooking the sea, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates. Brother Mark and the remaining monks chanted prayers over his grave, celebrating his life and commending his soul to God. In the scriptorium, the work continued. Brother Mark took Thomas's place as master illuminator, teaching the craft to others, maintaining the tradition. The catalogue Thomas had created was used and valued, the copies he had made preserved in various monasteries across England. The Psalter remained in the library, a testament to his skill and devotion. Centuries later, that Psalter would be discovered by scholars studying medieval manuscripts, would be photographed and studied, would be recognized as an exceptional example of 12th century illumination. Thomas's name, signed to that final portrait of Saint Benedict, would be noted and recorded. His work would be appreciated by people he could never have imagined, in times and circumstances utterly foreign to his experience. The messages from the monastery, the manuscripts Thomas copied and illuminated the catalogue he created, the knowledge he preserved, traveled forward through time, carrying with them the labor and love of a monk who spent his life pushing back against darkness, creating beauty and preserving wisdom. They spoke of a world that valued learning and art, that saw the preservation of knowledge as sacred work, that believed individual effort could contribute to something eternal. Brother Thomas's life was quiet and contained, lived within the walls of a single monastery, following routines that varied little from day to day. But through his work, his influence extended far beyond those walls, far beyond his lifetime, touching lives and minds he would never know existed. The light he preserved continued to shine, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, a gift from the medieval past to all the futures that would follow. In the stone chambers of the monastery, in the scriptorium where he spent so many hours, in the library he helped catalogue and preserve, Brother Thomas's presence lingered long after his death. Monks who worked there decades and centuries later felt it, though they couldn't name it, a sense of purpose, of continuity, of being part of something larger than themselves, of work that mattered. The monastery at Lindisfarne would eventually be dissolved during the Reformation, its monks dispersed, its buildings abandoned. But the manuscripts survived, scattered to various collections, preserved in libraries and museums, still carrying their cargo of knowledge and beauty into an unimaginably different world. Thomas's Psalter survived, his catalogue survived, copies he made survived, embodying his life's work, his devotion, his contribution to the great human project of remembering and knowing. In quiet rooms where scholars study medieval manuscripts, in climate-controlled archives where ancient books are preserved, in digital databases where images of illuminated pages are stored and shared, the messages from the monastery continue to speak. They tell of a time when books were precious and rare, when the written word was sacred, when monks like Brother Thomas dedicated their lives to preservation and creation. They tell of human beings reaching across time, sending messages to unknown futures, hoping to be remembered, hoping their work will matter, hoping the light they preserved will continue to shine. And it does shine still, after all these centuries, a testament to the power of dedication, the value of craft, the importance of preservation, the human need to create and communicate and connect across the boundaries of time and death. Brother Thomas's story, like the manuscripts he created, is a message from the past, speaking to all who will listen about what matters, about what endures, about what it means to live a life of purpose and devotion. His hands that ached from the cold, that trembled in old age, that formed thousands upon thousands of letters and images are dust now, long dissolved back into the earth. But the letters remain, the images remain, the beauty and knowledge he worked so hard to preserve remain. And in that remaining, in that persistence across centuries, there is a kind of immortality, a triumph over the oblivion that claims us all. Brother Thomas, who worried about being forgotten, who wondered if his work would matter, achieved through that work a legacy more lasting than wealth or power, more meaningful than fame or recognition. He preserved light, and the light he preserved continues to illuminate, continues to inspire, continues to speak of human possibility and achievement. The messages from the monastery sent across the gulf of time by hands long stilled and voices long silent arrive still in our present bearing their cargo of beauty and knowledge, asking to be received, to be valued, to be remembered. And in receiving them, in valuing them, in remembering the anonymous and not so anonymous monks who created them, we honor the human capacity for devotion, for craft, for the preservation of what is valuable, for the creation of meaning in a world that constantly threatens to dissolve into chaos and forgetting. Brother Thomas's life, documented in records sparse and fragmentary, revealed fully only in the work he left behind, stands as testament to countless other lives lived in similar dedication, to all those who have worked quietly and without recognition to preserve, to create, to pass forward what they valued. His story is their story, and in telling it, we remember them all, we honor them all, we acknowledge that their work mattered and continues to matter. The monastery is ruins now, stones scattered and overgrown. The buildings where Thomas lived and worked long since crumbled into picturesque decay. But the books survive, the words survive, the images survive, carrying forward through time the best of what medieval monasticism achieved, the preservation of knowledge, the creation of beauty, the demonstration that human life can be dedicated to something beyond mere survival, that work done with care and devotion can outlast the worker and speak to generations unborn. In the end, Brother Thomas achieved what he hoped to achieve. He preserved light in a darkening world. He created beauty that would outlast him. He contributed to the great human project of remembering and knowing. His life, quiet and contained within monastery walls, reached far beyond those walls through the work of his hands, the labor of his days, the devotion of his calling. The messages from the monastery continue to arrive, continue to speak, continue to illuminate, and in receiving them, we become part of the chain of transmission, part of the community of those who value what Thomas valued, who understand what he understood, that the preservation of knowledge and beauty is sacred work, that individual effort can matter across centuries, that light carefully tended can shine on and on and on, long after the hands that kindled it have returned to dust.